review meeting. We are calling this meeting to order at 5:30 p.m. At this time, I'll turn it over to Dr. Watts to begin the meeting.
Thank you, Vice President Daniels, members of the board, staff, and community. First of all, I want to thank each and every one of us for the work that has taken place, particularly within our organizational effectiveness community, and even more particularly our budget and finance team. Thank you to Ben and team, as well as our staff from Human Resources, Tim and Jamie, for supporting this work. At this time, I will introduce our board work session for the 2020-2021 budget presentation, and I will turn it over to Executive Director for Budget and Finance, Ben Brarick. Ben, the floor is yours.
Great. And okay, it looks like Karen is great. That was going to be my question. Okay, well, it's good to be speaking with you all again. You'll recall the last budget session we had in person. We did it there in the boardroom, and a tremendous amount has transpired since then, both in the district, but also in the world, probably more significantly and profoundly. So keep that in mind as we're going through the presentation. So this is structured as a part A, part B, part C. So I'm going to be doing kind of some introductory remarks and take us through some of the history and context of how we got to where we are and some of the COVID related challenges that we're going to be facing. Then the middle part really gets into, the 85% of the budget piece, which is some of the staffing. And then at the end, I will close with some concluding thoughts. With that, Karen, you want me to indicate next slide? How are we going to do this?
I think that would be helpful.
Okay, I'll just say next.
Thank you.
Sure. There we go. So as context, I want to continue to bring this in front of the board to understand kind of what our North Star is from a purely budget and finance standpoint. These were five, what I refer to colloquially as the 5 for 5, our 5 financial goals for 5 years in KSD. And these are now about 18 months old. And we certainly made progress towards these goals. Some of them we've even achieved. So the top 5 remain to kind of increase our transparency and communication on the budget, which I think we've done in a number of different ways, to maintain a fund balance that's commensurate with our board policy, which last year was the first year that we achieved that goal after a long sequence of nearly 5 years where we did not. Number 3 is probably the most significant goal, and that is to keep a positive revenue to expense ratio out into the future, meaning that, to not get into a institutional habit of spending more than we take in. Item number 4 was to eliminate our interfund loan that we relied on when our fund balance was so low, and we did that last year, and we continue to proceed all the way through this year without the need for a general fund interfund loan. And then finally, to improve our bond rating, which we have made some progress on, but still remain well short of where we want to be, which is an AA3 or higher, which would be kind of commensurate with where many of our larger school districts in the state, your North Shores, for example, your Lake Washingtons, that's where they currently sit, and that's where we want to be. Next slide, please. Okay. So again, some of the context is that I kind of see how we confronted one set of challenges and we're about to confront a different set. But our first set of challenges is that we and as an institution, we were not kind of upholding that goal 3 of not spending, keeping the revenue to expense ratio consistent. And so we had a couple of years of consecutive poor performance that put us in a negative fund balance position at the end of fiscal year 17, and then a very small negative fund balance situation in fiscal year 18, which put us in a situation of increased monitoring with OSPI and ESD, and needless to say, an increased auditing environment as well. Next slide, please. So we made tremendous gains from where we were, but now as we make gains on that first mountain, we have a second mountain kind of staring at us, which is that we are one of all school districts in the state that are dealing with the global pandemic. And there's a variety of different ways in which that pandemic will impact Kent and impact all school districts. This is a slide that I took straight from the Seattle Times. In fact, some of you may have seen it when it ran in the newspaper. And this is a good historical reminder of what happens to state funding when the revenue sources that the state relies on take a hit. And so what you see in this graph is that you'll see the beige, which is the signifies the local portion of funding. Not a lot of variance during that time. Pretty stable local. What did certainly take a hit was state funding, and so you could see that we were clearly on an upward trajectory of funding in fiscal year 16, 17, or excuse me, 06, 07, 08, all the way through 09, and then it plateaued and dropped. And what I've been hearing anecdotally is that the size, the magnitude of the impact that the state expects from COVID is significantly larger than that which they experienced, at least initially, from the original housing bubble. And so this is important context for where we may be headed as a system. Next slide. Okay. The governor and the governor's budget director have said as much, basically telling school districts through OSPI a few things. One of which was if you add new programs or new staff, do so very cautiously. And that we can also expect reductions going into the next biennium. The issue that will come up, which I imagine we'll be talking about at some point, is that although technically a lot of the funding that comes to public school districts in Washington is protected, constitutionally protected as part of the program of basic education. In times of crisis, when the legislature gets put in a pinch to choose between new taxes or cuts, that definition gets tested. And so just because we collectively view those dollars as constitutionally protected doesn't mean that protection is infallible or won't be tested. Next slide, please. Okay, so here is a few ways in which we could expect to be impacted by the global pandemic. Some of these are true for all districts, but some of them take on a specific flavor for the Kent School District. The first is that you have probably been reading, and we have tried to update you as we've gone, that there has been funding provided from the federal government in the form of the CARES Act. OSPI actually went so far as to kind of give us a sense of how much money we could expect from that. Most recently, though, we've been hearing that the likelihood that the legislature will supplant that funding is pretty high. And just to go over what that means, supplantation means that basically for every dollar we receive from federal, that we will be deducted $1 from state. So net, it really wouldn't benefit us, right? And so that's really important for our planning, because if we see that federal dollars is new money, we might be setting ourselves up for a, for a fall in that respect. Another thing that can tend to happen in these situations is that property values can fall as housing sales cool, and people are, because they're losing their jobs, they're unable to pay the higher rates, etc. As property values fall, that affects the amount of money we can raise with the same tax rate. And then, of course, we also rely on a certain amount of taxpayer money coming in every year. Like if we assess that taxpayers need to pay $50 million in support of the public schools, year after year, we've, 98% of payers typically pay. Well, in times of economic distress, that number drops as well. And then finally, and I don't think this is something that we have discussed, I and a number of people throughout the region are concerned about enrollment during this period of time. There are a number of factors at play. Probably the most significant of which is that as we continue in an online learning environment, and there is certainly a chance that we start the year in some form of online learning environment, and I don't mean to say that that's a decision that's been made, but certainly that's among the possibilities. Parents become a little bit more free agents in a market of online education providers. And they are not necessarily tethered to the geographic region in which they live. So a parent that resides in Kent could elect to enroll their student in a program in Walla Walla, Washington, as long as the online provider is certified and is an approved provider in the state of Washington. So for that reason, I've actually projected that we will lose some students, and that is going to impact our revenue. Next slide. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to hand it off with the theme that I feel very, very good and gratified about the progress that we have made towards our 5 for 5, those goals that we articulated early, but we certainly are facing another challenge. We're in a stable situation now, but certainly turbulence ahead. And at this point, I'd like to turn it over to the HR team.
Because this is the first time that she will be presenting and speaking, presenting to and speaking with you all, I want to introduce Jamie Frazier, who is our Human Resources Director of Operations, who manages staffing for basic education and other staffing throughout the district. So Jamie, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Can everybody hear me okay?
Hey, Jamie.
Perfect. Hello. Thank you. Good evening, President Hamada, members of the board, Dr. Watts and Ms. Helly. If we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so this slide is just kind of an overview of what I'm going to be going over with you today. First, I'm going to start with an overview of how we actually do our staffing projections for basic ed, and then I will roll into the actual staffing projections for the 2021 school year for certificated basic ed staffing allocations. So we'll just go over some of the things like our staffing allocation timeline, how staffing allocations are developed, and some key deadlines. So we can go to the next slide. All right, and then one more, please. Perfect, thank you. Okay, so Human Resources develops the preliminary staffing allocation timeline that's distributed. We distribute it in November, December for hiring for the upcoming school year. It's focused on administrator, teacher, para-educator, and clerical staffing at our schools. And the timeline impacts central administration communities as well and teams, and the coordination of the teams with one another for purposes of staffing. The finalized timeline is shared with cabinet, labor partners, and principals in December, and then it moves throughout the school year as we follow along. Next slide, please. Just some key dates for you, just for a better understanding of how we progress throughout the year. March 19th is our 60th day. We end all hiring for our 9 and 10-month employees at that time, so we can start moving forward towards the following school year. April 15th, the projections and staffing were provided to the principals and communities and returned on the 27th by the buildings. Then we walked through our KEA IVT process, and then on May 13th, our principals were able to go ahead and start posting positions, interviewing and filling those vacant positions that we have.
Jamie, just for everybody's mutual understanding, because some people may be familiar with that, can you briefly explain what the IVT is?
Yes, so as we send out the projected staffing allocations, buildings will go through and work their master schedule. They may be reducing in some areas and be overstaffed. And then some buildings may have positions that are understaffed. So that's a time where we can shift certificated staff around between buildings to kind of fill in the holes that were understaffed in, and then take care of some overstaffing at that point within the buildings. Was that helpful? Perfect. Okay, and we'll move on to the next slide. Excellent, thank you. Okay, so in late November, student enrollment projections are developed by fiscal services, and the first week of December, or around that time, are given to human resources. So on this slide, this is an example of the document that HR receives from fiscal services, and it includes the building enrollment projections for the upcoming school year. We see a longer portion of this. It's broken down by building as well as by grade level. So each building has an enrollment projection, and then at the end there, that's the full grouping. And next, please. All right, so once the enrollment projections are received, Human Resources reviews the enrollment projections and adjusts them based on additional factors that contribute to the staffing of basic ed classrooms. These factors can be include student transfers, both in and out of the buildings, adjustments for the Odyssey classrooms, as well as dual language, along with other factors that impact basic ed allocation. So this is an example of where you might see the adjustment and then the total gen ed student count at the end there. That's what we would use to move forward with staffing allocations. Next slide. All right, so once the class counts have been finalized for each grade, Human Resources then applies a staffing ratio as determined to determine the projected basic ed FTE for each building. The projections are made within the KEA CBA class size language, as well as budgetary decisions for the upcoming school year. And that's just some examples of the class size language in the KEA CBA. All right, next slide. Okay, so the determined staffing ratio is then calculated for each grade level and compared to the staffing ratio in the CBA, KEA CBA, and then reviewed for either overload or overcap. So we go through each grade level manually just to make sure that our calculations are right. This particular sample is a sample of a building that has both Odyssey and dual language programs within the building. So it shows the different considerations needed to determine FTE in the building. So for example, not double counting Odyssey or dual language students in the non-dual language basic ed classrooms. So you really do need to make sure the students, everybody has a seat and distributed even accordingly. Next slide. All right, and then once that's determined for elementary buildings, once the projected staffing numbers have been determined, Human Resources then creates projected allocation sheets that are sent to the building. Looks very similar to the previous slide, but this is what we send out to the buildings. The projection sheets include both basic ed and categorical staffing, along with administrator, clerical, and our paraeducator staffing. And this section shows what the basic ed distribution would look like. And again, similar thing, it's got 3 different basic ed as well as Odyssey classrooms and dual language. Next slide. All right. And then this one is looking at a secondary allocation. So on the left, you see that the basic ed portion of the projected allocation sheet, you'll notice there's a subtotal and then the CTE students subtracted from the projected student enrollment. Again, we subtract those so that the basic ed classroom allocations are not inflated. Once the projected basic ed student count has been calculated, it's then divided by the determined staffing ratio to establish the projected allocation for basic ed. For secondary, this gives them a bucket of FTE for basic education classrooms, again, to include music, PE, and core subjects that are required to graduate. And then the principals would then create their master schedules based off of student registration. Again, these allocation sheets, this is the basic ed section. They include the basic ed classrooms, administrator staffing, support staff, categorical, as well as paraeducator and clerical. Next slide. All right. So the following slides, we're going to outline the 2021 certificated basic education staffing. So this slide shows when developing the basic education staffing allocations, we look to balance financial resources and human resources. Some items that are taken into consideration when developing the certificated basic ed staffing models are we ensuring opportunity and access to rigorous course offerings, making sure we can comply with CBA class size parameters. That was the class size, the CBA language that we spoke about. Look to minimize the impacts to students and staff when implementing a financially stable staffing model, and then ensuring additional staffing supports are in place to assist certificated basic education positions. So it's balancing those items as we look through what we're allocating to our buildings. Next slide. Okay, so when we were developing the certificated basic ed staffing model for the 2021 school year, we made the adjustment for high school. The ratio for 1920 was 1:27. We reduced that down to 1:26 for the 2021 school year. We found that it was pretty tight last year as we staffed, and we did need to go ahead and add in additional staffing throughout the year. So we adjusted for that this upcoming school year. Class size ratios for the 2021 school year remain the same for grades 4 through 6 at 1:28, and the middle school ratio stayed the same as well at 1:26. And then we staffed at 1:23 as a baseline for our K3 classes with the district ratio of 1:17. So we went ahead and took into consideration staffing for 1:17 moving into next school year. Last year, we added that in a bit later, I would say mid-June. So we went ahead and accounted for that best we can as we move forward.
Amy, can you please clarify the difference between class size and the staffing ratio? That's the 1:17 ratio that that we, are meeting the OSPI requirements.
Yeah, it's on another slide coming up
Okay.
if we want to readdress it, and then if you still think it needs clarifying.
Apologies. Thank you.
No worries. I had it in there twice, so.
Okay.
Yeah. So next, we'll go to the next slide. All right, so with the staffing model that we kind of outlined there, KSD will add 22 additional FTE in basic education classrooms. This graph shows a comparison of basic education FTE from the 1920 to 21 school year and the projections for 2021. The breakdown of the increase, as you can see, is 13.5 FTE for K3, 0.5 FTE for 4 through 6, so there's a split there, and then as well as secondary, we added in an additional 8 FTE. As you can see, the majority was in the K3. It's also important to note that the increase of the 22 FTE is in addition to the FTE that we needed to add throughout the school year last year. One for the K3, and then also the additional FTE we needed to add in to secondary. And then this increase represents a $2.3 million increase for the upcoming school year. And next slide. So the increase in FTE reflects the adjustments made to class size ratio for high school, the K3 compliance, and additional enhanced FTE added to secondary buildings. The staffing model considers the integrity of the instructional program, commitments with KSD's labor partners, and financial sustainability by working to avoid deficit spending. And as you can see there, as mentioned in the previous slide, so we started out with a K3 1:23 baseline, and then we adjusted as needed to meet the 1:17 compliance. We can use a staffing FTE in K3 for additional staffing beyond classroom staffing, which can include PE, music, the specialists, special ed, high cap, and ELL. So we can take a portion of that FTE and apply it to the district-wide ratio. And then we run it through a K3 calculator, we call it, and can see where we're projected to land, I would say, for 1:17. And then we've also built in contingency FTE to address class sizes that move beyond caps and programmatic needs as we engage with the principals throughout the year, just to watch those class sizes and see where we may be reaching cap, or we may be needing to add additional staffing because of enrollment throughout the year. And then we added an enhanced staffing at secondary level to support master schedules and core classes and the unique needs of the building. So we sent out the initial projected staffing allocations. Principals, secondary principals reviewed it and worked through their master schedules, and then we added in enhanced staffing as needed to support their programs in their buildings. And next slide, thank you. So this slide shows projected splits as needed to ensure all class sizes are within the staffing ratio and class caps for that grade, and we do this for elementary only. The graph on the left shows a 3-year comparison of basic ed splits compared to total elementary basic ed FTE. The increase for the 18-19 school year, as you can see, it's quite a big jump there, represents the adjustment in the basic ed staffing allocation model as we work towards the fiscal stability of the district. The pie chart on the right shows a breakdown of projected splits for the 2021 school year. Most of the splits are in grades 4 through 5, and as you can see, we don't have any K1 splits allocated for the upcoming school year. As the projected basic ed staffing allocations are built for the upcoming school year, things that we take in consideration when we're adding in splits are building capacity. We have some space issues in some of our buildings, so we take that into consideration. If we're adding in FTE in the building, we want to make sure that we're not staffing over their capacity of classrooms. And then distribution of the enrollment throughout buildings and grades, as well as staffing decisions for the upcoming school year. And then again, continued financial commitment to the district. Staffing allocations are built on projected enrollment, so we'll continue to monitor enrollment throughout the months leading up to the start of the school year. And again, we can make adjustments as needed if we need to dissolve a split. If we can, based on student enrollment, we can do so at that time. And then my last slide. So some things that are not built into the additional FTE for the basic ed is positions funded by categorical dollars, like title, LAP, ELL, music and PE and library for elementary, and then at secondary, positions funded by categorical dollars and CT. All right.
Thank you, Jamie. Is that the last slide?
That is my last slide. Yep.
Okay.
I'll give back to Ben. Sorry.
I wonder if, and I'll defer to Ben kind of about the flow of the presentation. Would it be helpful to stop and take questions related to these slides, or do you think it would make more sense to hold questions for the end?
I think it's a good idea to take questions now. That's a good idea.
Okay. So if directors, if you have any questions for Jamie about this information, I know this is maybe the first time for a lot of folks to kind of see how the staffing allocations actually work and kind of the factors that we apply into those. I know that there's been a lot of interest in, some programmatic cuts in the past and other things like that. So just wanted to have the opportunity to chat about if you have any questions, and Jamie and I can do our best to answer the questions that you have, or we can pledge to get you that information as soon as we reasonably can if we don't have the answers immediately available to us.
So I have, oh, go ahead.
Go. Go ahead.
So I do have a question with regards to your split classes. How I'm thinking that you guys have a process for determining which students might do better with the split versus those that would not do better. Is that so? What is the process of determining students that may need extra support, or how are students placed into a split? What is that? Just kind of an overview of how that's determined.
So I would say that the principals are working with their building staff to distribute the students into the classrooms. If they do have concern regarding placing a split there, I have conversation. We can take a look at other options, but HR per se doesn't place the students into the classrooms. It really is allocating the projected FTE, and then the principals would build out the classrooms from there.
So there's no structure or standard in place for looking at, okay, well, maybe this student may need some extra support based on previous performance. So maybe they would not be a good fit to go into a split because they might, there's no kind of district way or district standard for looking at that.
Director Daniel, or excuse me, Vice President Daniels, I will add, I know we did discuss briefly yesterday in more detail. Those conversations are, as Jamie mentioned, are certainly a part of a principal's conversation and discussion with HR or staffing. More importantly, the Executive Director for Learning Improvement is also a part of that conversation as well, focusing on which students are performing well, having conversations based on assessment data in a normal situation, and then determining. In fact, I actually sat in on one of those meetings at, it was, now I can remember, it wasn't Pine Tree, but it was Panther Lake last year, as we focused on staffing as well as creating a multi-age, or in this case, a split classroom focused on student performance. So that is one way in which that process is executed.
Thank you.
So my question was just, so how many dollars or how many FTE is included in these positions funded by categorical dollars, music, PE, library? How does that hit our budget? How did all these positions on this slide that we stopped at affect our budget? I have no idea.
So the positions on this slide include basic education classrooms only. So I don't have information. We can certainly get that for you, what that would look like outside of the basic ed. For secondary, in the bucket for basic ed, it includes the music programs as well as PE. So that's included in there. But for categorical, we'd have to go back and take a look of the increases there. This is specifically focused on basic education.
Director Bettinger, we can certainly get you that information. I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say, Director Bettinger, that the categorical dollars, LAP and title, are supplemental. They are not part of basic ed, and they are allocated by school in a formula. And X amount of those dollars go for staffing, but we can get you the LAP amount and the Title I amount that specifically go towards staffing above and beyond.
Great.
So my question was related, but I wanted to understand the process by which we would decide on the number of FTEs, given that categorical dollars may very likely be reduced down the road. So is that decision made independent of what will happen in the state or in the federal government when we come up with the basic education funding for FTEs?
I can share that Rana Pop, our Director of Categorical Programs and Student Family Support Services, is working closely with OSPI with respect to allocations, which are around Title I and LAP. You heard Mr. Eric talk about the CARES dollars. So far, we have not been told that there is a reduction in Title I allocations or the LAP allocations. And so we're still closing out, of course, this budget year for both those categories, but we have not heard that to this point. And so we're moving ahead with the preliminary allocations, which we're talking about today.
I have a question for Ben. I was at a meeting this morning, Mr. Eric, and I was told that in the CARES Act that's coming out, that they're going to give to school districts and kids that were on free and reduced lunch a debit card for the dollar amount that they would normally get for free and reduced lunch. Is that just for the summer allocation? Is that going to continue? And I'm wondering if that's going to replace our free and reduced lunch, because it's going directly to the families with kids, and then they're supposed to buy food for their kids with that dollars, as I understand.
I can speak a little bit to that too, Ben, if you want. It's up to.
I was just going to say, I don't oversee food services, so I was going to punt that to you.
So it's called federally, they call it pandemic EBT because it's tied to EBT. And the way the program works is that it is for the period from the date of federal state of emergency related to COVID, so back to March 17th, through the close of the school year, is my understanding. So for most states who got this waiver, and Washington just got theirs about a week or two ago, it's going to be retroactive from the date of closure through the end of the school year. So families will likely receive a lump sum for the number of children times the cost of the meal per day on a card per child in the house for them to purchase meals. It's not something that looks like it's going to be extended through the summer or into the fall. So it's that kind of one-time payment that will come. So it's not something that districts will receive at all. It's going to go directly to families' households. It's not something that's going to flow through any of the nutrition services programs. The districts themselves will see no benefit to this. It'll be direct benefit to families, and it'll be for a retroactive period of time.
But that didn't affect the free and reduced lunch that we gave from March 17 on. The Fed's doing that, right?
No, so they're not necessarily going to take money from us. It's additional monies to families. So we are neutral in that. We're not beneficiaries or losers as a school district when it comes to pandemic EBT.
Yeah, because the person I talked to this morning didn't understand it quite so well then. Thank you. And I have another question just in general. If we're going to go to classrooms and our whole model is going to be totally different, and we have to reduce the class sizes and perhaps even go more virtually with our high schools, how is all of this going to weigh in a whole new projected system? I mean, you're gearing this whole program on what was.
So President Hamada, now you're skipping into Part C. And so, so that's part of Part C's context. So before we get there, and we'll circle back around to make sure we've addressed some of your questions to the extent that we have full answers. Are there any other questions related to Parts A and B before we? I'll add one more piece. We were talking about staffing just briefly. We didn't lead with, and I'm surprised Ben usually says this, that staffing is 85% of our budget.
I did say that.
I'm sorry, then I apologize. I must have missed it because that's usually something you say up front.
Go to the videotape.
Yeah, he started with
it. And that's one of the reasons why we decided to make that such a big chunk right now of part of our context of our budget next year. So I apologize.
Yes, I did want to ask about our principals and their involvement. I feel like I ask this every year, but I know most of the conversation was about sending information to the principals, the projections and the staffing, and what is their involvement in this whole decision process?
Jamie, do you want to speak a little bit to the process, and then from the exec cabinet level, we can follow up after that about some of the decisions.
Yeah, so once they get their projected allocation sheets, the principals engage with HR once they kind of get a view of what their projections are and work through what that might look like for their master schedules. And then we walk through where they're still needing additional support, whether it be for, the core classes or a lot of times middle schools, once they transition from PE into health, they have class size and class cap issues. So we continue to work through the additional needs of the buildings, and then that's where that additional enhanced FTE will come into place. We work together to decide, okay, this is the additional FTE that we'll need to be able to run our master schedules.
And Mariah and Jamie, were you involved in those meetings with principals?
For the equitable staffing?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you want to explain that process a little bit too?
Yeah, so throughout the year, I think we started it, I want to say late fall, we were meeting with the levels, secondary levels, middle school, high school, and going over where those they were needing some additional supports and enhanced staffing, what programs were needing additional FTE to be able to run. There were a few that needed to have a full 1.0 FTE for their program. So we walked through identifying those areas. They were obviously different for middle school as they were for high school. So we've got a lot of that information and started working on an equitable staffing model for them. It hasn't come to full fruition, but I think it was a good start, and then engaging with the principals to work through some of those immediate needs for this school year. So I would say that's the level for me, at least, the engagement with the principals.
Yeah, and then, related to Jamie's comment about it not coming to full fruition, as we were making these final staffing decisions, we were doing it through video chat, which is indicative of some of the, we were in the COVID crisis. And so some of those additional enhancements that we had hoped to be able to put into place, there was a decision made to hold off on some of them because of this pending financial difficulty that most public entities in the state of Washington are going to be facing. So we wanted to be careful about not making a mistake of overspending on staffing when the future is uncertain, and try to strike a balance there. So, I mean, there is always a cost benefit relationship there, right? You don't want to staff too tight. And I think, we did move forward with some of those enhancements, and you could see the enhanced staffing ratios that Jamie explained previously. And so we were able to implement some of those, but unfortunately not all of them, given the current financial outlook.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And I'm being told that through some of our partners that they really appreciated the principals having more say in the budgetary and staffing. But when it came down to what really happened, that a lot of the things that they had desired were not fulfilled at all. You find that to be a true statement?
I do have to acknowledge that some of the things that they desired weren't fulfilled. We did meet some of the requests and were able to meet some of them. But I think it is an accurate statement that not all of the desires were fulfilled in this staffing allocation, given the uncertain nature of the finances of the district.
Thank you, Tim.
You're welcome.
And in fairness to the process, President Hamada, I would say rarely are all desires met in any budgeting process. I know that the challenges this particular year are still unknown and uncertain. And so we're cautious, and we'll talk more about that. But I think in every budget season, there are requests and desires that are not met.
So with that, we've got plenty of time for questions this evening, but just wanted to make sure everybody had the opportunity to ask any additional questions that you have before Ben moves into wonderings and thoughts about the future. Okay, Mr. Eric, looks like the floor is yours.
Okay.
Thank you, Jamie.
Next slide, please. Okay, so now I included some slides in here that are kind of a current stock taking. Next slide, please. So I find this slide to be helpful. When I got here, the district had a negative fund balance. So on this chart, we would have been literally the only bar going in the other direction. And for the first 2 years, we were the district on the far right of this graph, meaning that among large school districts, you had $200 million general fund budget or larger. We had, at least in fiscal year 18, we were at the very end. Fiscal year 17, we were at the very end. Now at the end of fiscal year 19, I think we're in good shape. And so part of what I want to be clear about today's discussion is there's a difference between talking about our current financial health, which I want to be clear is stable, versus the financial health of the state and kind of our future outlook, which is fraught. Okay, I don't want those two things to be conflated. And so but this does put our fund balance in perspective. So, you know, we had a series of meetings last year where we talked about the fund balance and, you know, some opinion that it was way too large and so forth. You know, in the context of the districts that are our peers, we're certainly not out of whack. If anything, we're a little bit lower than the median, if you will, in terms of percentage. And so, frankly, I think this is a pretty good place to be in terms of fund balance relative to our peers. You don't want to be on the far left, and you don't necessarily be on the far right. We've had the experience of being on the far right, but we have clearly stabilized. What we're talking about now in terms of the financial situation in the district is really more about how will these emerging challenges impact us in unknown ways. And Director Hamada started to allude to that in terms of, you know, how does this change our revenues? How does this change staffing? You know, you're staffing based on a world that existed before. What does it look like in the new frontier, et cetera? Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the, you know, the follow the bubble slide that you've seen for every board meeting for probably 3 years. What's happening right now is that we are certainly, I guess you could say, quote unquote, benefiting financially from the fact that we are closed in a bricks and mortar environment. There are lots of cost centers that we just simply don't utilize because we are closed. So our fund balance will certainly come in higher than we probably thought about in the fall and early winter. But you can kind of see, you can just kind of follow the trajectory of this line and see that we're going to finish considerably higher than last year. And I'm not concerned about fiscal year 20. My anxiety or my thinking is more about fiscal year 21 and 20. Most pronounced 22 is where it really seems to, where many prognosticators think it will really come to roost at the state level. Next slide. Okay, so here I'd like to talk a little bit about enrollment. Jamie did a good job of walking you through a slide earlier in part B, I guess we're calling it, where we make our enrollment projections. We make those at the district level. We make those at the school level. Then we give schools an opportunity to kind of look at those and respond. We go through a whole process. And then we have a pandemic. And so we have revised our enrollment assumptions. We were thinking in the fall and early winter that we would have very small growth, maybe 100 FTE growth. We have revised those based on further collaboration with our demographer and some discussion and analysis of what's happening. There are a number of factors at play, some of them regional, but some of them Kent specific. We talked about one specifically, which is that in the online or virtual environment, parents are more of a free agent space, so to speak. They have more options and choices in terms of where they choose to enroll their students. Again, I'm making some assumptions about how we start the year and how long that would go and everything else. But to the extent that a virtual component of education continues to persist through the fall in any form, frankly, that puts parents in a decision-making space that they have not previously been in. And you start to consider the market dimensions of, okay, who might choose to enroll with a provider like a WAVA or a K-12 Insight or any of the state online providers who are approved through OSPI to serve students regardless of where they live. And again, I think I mentioned this earlier, that it doesn't matter that you live in Kent. If you want to enroll with an online provider in a district 4 counties away, and they're approved as a virtual provider, that you can do so. And indeed many do. I think the Steilacoom School District, as one example, It's a fairly small school district by resident enrollment, but actually, and I don't know if this is still true, I was watching this very closely when I was down at the state, and their enrollment with virtual was far in excess of their enrollment as to their demographic or their boundary residents. And so one wonders how this will influence enrollment, not just in Kent, but for all school districts. Another thing that probably uniquely impacts Kent is that many of our larger employers, and again, they may not even necessarily reside within the city limits of Kent, but simply that there are many parents or guardians who work for those providers, such as a Boeing, or such as subsidiary providers and distributors of Boeing, to the extent that there is job loss or furlough. You very much could see outward migration from the high cost regions to the lower cost regions. King County is a high cost region. Kent certainly not as high cost as some of our neighbors to the north, but it could be a scenario where, you know, choices are made for families in terms of what they can afford from a housing standpoint. And it's just a matter of how quickly and in what manner these sorts of economic reverberations set in. It was also raised in a regional call with me, what we will call the football effect, which is that where you have families or students for whom student activities is central in terms of their identity, their importance to school, etc. You may have scenarios of students going to live with grandma or going to live with a relative in a state that is perhaps further along in phases or more conducive to these sorts of activities. Again, this makes a lot of assumptions about a future that we don't know about, but these are all scenarios that certainly could play out. Next slide. Okay. You've been hearing about the CARES Act. We were informed about a month ago, given a spreadsheet, that Kent could be eligible for $7.3 million of funding through the CARES Act. As distinguished from what you were talking about with Dr. Harmon earlier, which is not money that flows through the school district. We're talking about money that would flow directly through the school district. So I want to add some caution here. The last time that we went through a major economic slowdown and the last time that there was major stimulus from the federal government, the state legislature supplanted those funds, which meant that essentially they used those funds to keep us whole rather than flowing through those funds, meaning dollar for dollar we would have more. There has been robust discussion in my last two regional budget conferences with the state about this, and they have been clear that that is absolutely a possibility. And if I'm reading through the lines, it might be more than a possibility. So I'm not spending a lot of time talking about the CARES Act because I don't, in the end, think that it's going to be a game changer for us in terms of our financial position, but we will be going through some administrative procedures, you know, if the process stays the way that it's been set up, to demonstrate COVID expenses, submit and show that we've had these expenses, receive a certain amount of that $7.3 million in phase one, then have an opportunity to go back for a phase two. And so there will be a process. But if I was a betting man, I would say that in the end, it is unlikely to fundamentally change our current financial situation, or that that I'm looking at for next year as well. Next slide. Okay. The one thing that we do have right now is we have a pretty good look at our revenues. I actually just yesterday we kind of got a real good detailed look at that, and I'm going to have kind of a more detailed chart for you in the next presentation. Didn't quite make the cut for this one, but what you can kind of think about is that state funding from here on out is expected to be very modest, and indeed I'm expecting future cuts. But for next year, the most significant funding increase from the state is going to be tied to I believe it's a 1.6%. Tim, did I say 1.6? 1.6% implicit price deflator inflationary change. Really, our most significant funding increase will come from the local levy. So here we show by a school year basis. You're accustomed to seeing this by calendar years, but this shows over the next 2 years the amount that we would expect to collect in addition if property values continue as we had originally projected. Now there is of course a risk there, because you remember when we went to the voters, we talked about a flat tax rate, right? And managing to the rate. And as tax rates go down, as property values go down, tax rates produce less money. Okay, if you hold the tax rate constant and values go down, you receive less funds. And so, so our revenue picture historically has been how much more is the state going to give us? And then the local was kind of supplemental. In the next year, possibly 2 years, it flips a little bit. Our local levy is going to be the more robust part of that, and the state funding is more than likely going to be incremental or perhaps even negative. Next slide. Okay. So this gets to a little bit of what I was alluding to earlier, which is that, you know, we maintain a detailed spreadsheet in the annals of our team here about, okay, how much do we expect to collect in local levy proceeds by month? And then how much did we actually collect? And we're already starting to see a drop. It started in March. We saw a little more pronounced in April. And so we lost about, you know, more or less about $600,000 on our last two collections. We're projecting over the full year to be about $4 million less than what we had originally projected. Honestly, these results are better than I thought they were going to be. So I'm heartened by that, but it is having an impact, and I expect it to have a more significant impact as we move into next collection cycle. Next slide, please. Okay. When we refer to the MSC allocations, MSC stands for maintenance, supplies, and operating costs. Remember, it's kind of the shorthand for everything that's not salary based. If you take salary and benefits and set that aside, it's kind of everything else that's, you're buying things, you're buying services, you're not buying staff. And so in that universe, there's two chunks of MSC expenditures. One chunk, the larger chunk, supports a lot of the core operations of the district. So we go out and buy liability insurance, we pay our utilities, you know, we pay a software license maybe. All those things are, you know, we pay for tuition for a special needs student. Those are all MSC expenditures that are centralized. We also allocate a per student amount to schools. We have a process where we allocate a base rate, and then we inflate that rate based on the special factors demonstrated by the student. So we provide more for students that are mobile or that qualify for free or reduced lunch, or English is a second language, for example. And we increased that rate this year after holding that down for 3 consecutive years to reflect the fact that we are more fiscally stable than we were. So you'll go back to 16, 17 and see that those rates were 62. These are the base rates were $62 and $60 at the secondary and elementary rate. And the proposal that you'll see comes up by half, if that makes sense. It comes up, but it doesn't come all the way back to where we were. Next slide. Okay. So you don't see it on the slide here, but it looks like we're going to project about $18 million of new revenue for next year. That is, you think about a $400+ million budget. That's, you know, in the 4% range, something like that. You'll get a chart the next time we talk. Most of that is local levy, and we are going to get some additional funding associated with special education because the state changed their funding formula. But there's also a couple other things going on. So as I mentioned, there's a 1.6% kind of COLA-based increase that we get from the state based on the implicit price deflator. There is the CARES Act to consider, but again, I'm considering that to be kind of a wash at this point, and frankly, we'll be surprised if it is not. The other thing is that we're going to take a pretty significant hit on our transportation funding. We were just informed pretty recently that we can expect a $2.5 million reduction in our funding for people transportation. This was in the works before the COVID, the discussions about the transportation funding, but I think that the impacts of COVID and the fact that we're not necessarily running the buses probably played into the final decision. The notion being that, well, you're not going to have as much expense in transportation, therefore we're not going to give you as much. I don't want to put words in the state's mouth, but the bottom line is that our revenue projections from the state show a $2.5 million reduction in people transportation funding. And then right now, even with a little allowance for a reduction in property tax, our single largest revenue increase is the local levy. We're projecting to increase by a collection of $11 million. Next slide. Okay, so kind of where we're at in the process right now, in the big picture, is that we have completed our analysis of revenue. We have completed our analysis of enrollment. And the final stage is to come up with our precise expenditure side estimates, which is tied up in finalizing collaboratively the final staffing decisions for the year that go beyond the basic ed that you've seen. And I believe, I don't want to speak out of turn, but I believe you will have another budget session. Perhaps Dr. Watts can speak to this, but the plan is that you would be presented kind of with the expenditure side of this equation in that final session. And that will kind of complete the picture. I'm available to answer any questions that you have.
Before we get into questions, I think when we were talking about this, we talked about the kind of key takeaways for the numerical side of the budget that you will see next as a board. Is this balance between fiscal sustainability and responsibility with measured growth. So as Ben stated, we are expecting to see an increase in levy dollars, but what our revenue reductions will look like from the state are still a little bit unknown. And so how do we cautiously walk toward expansion as a district who is stable without repeating history? And so as the longest serving executive cabinet member between HR and organizational effectiveness as we were preparing this conversation, it's not remiss on me that Kent School District is at a pivotal point of decision-making, something that we've been at a pivotal juncture like this before, where the state was making cuts and we were in a solid financial position and overspent. And so part of that initial slide that Ben shared with our 5 for 5 is that commitment to sustainability and not letting our expenditures exceed our revenue. And so as we go into our next presentation, the next round, that's something that I will continue to push. I'm sure Ben will remind as well that that's our goal. And so while we do believe that we will have some room for financial, additional financial expenditures and room for programmatic growth, we want to be cautious in that. And we don't want to commit to that too soon because it's still unknown what the state is going to remove from us. And now I'll open it up to questions.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't see, I mean, this is like in a household budget. If I had no idea what was going to happen, truly in the setup and the makeup of my expenditures in September, October, November, December, and into the next calendar year, I don't know how I could really project any type of a budget.
Except President Hamada, the law says that we must.
No, I know. I know. But I mean, Dr. Watson and I have talked about, you know, a lot of things that could majorly change with class sizes, with buildings, with transportation. If we are, I mean, if those are outlined in the OSPI guidelines that we have to build a model around, I don't know. But I mean, I don't know. I would be, if this were my household budget or my company that I owned, I would not know where to start with the budget, to be realistic. Talking about expansion, talking about more income. It sounds like, honestly, we're just like floating on something that we have no idea is going to happen. That's a big concern for me. That's all. So,
if I may, I think that's a concern I share. But there are some knowns and there are some unknowns, and so there's a couple things I'll reflect on here that are part of the known universe. So when we go through the budget process, a very big part of how we proceed is how the state is proceeding. So for example, the state indicates, you know, and they set up a process by which they estimate our revenues. They give us an indication as to whether they're changing their requirements on us. And so what's been noteworthy is that the state has been pretty consistent and has not actually completely revamped its revenue process or its projections. And so most of the districts, I think, are sharing your anxiety, which is that there's a lot of unknowns, but we are kind of operating in an environment where not just Kent, but I think all school districts are going, okay, so if this is the process and the construct that we're going to be operating, we will do that. We will do that conservatively. We will do that protecting our back end, but there's essentially no other process to operate on right now, right? So I think it's appropriate to kind of state the anxiety and the unknown and reflect on it and be aware of it. But we also, it's incumbent upon us, as it is with all the other 294 districts, to adopt a budget. By the way, we can amend that budget next year if we find that it's far more cataclysmic than we have been led to believe, or that, you know, circumstances change, etc. But we're kind of proceeding as so many of their large districts are, and that is many unknowns, but an obligation to move ahead.
So you talked about amending the budget next year if needed. Is that like what the contingency plan would be in case things didn't exactly pan out? Or is there anything that's more in depth that we would have to fall back on as a district? Or how does that look? Have you guys talked about that?
I have thought about it. So Dr. Harmon, did you want to speak?
Oh, no, go ahead. No, you go first and then I can.
Okay. So, yeah, you know, I have the unique perspective of having worked on the other side of this equation. So I worked both in the legislature and very closely with OSPI at the State Board of Education through the years where we went through our first kind of downturn. I kind of have a sense for how this goes. And, you know, there are the reason there is a process in law for amending your budget is because it is not without precedent for the state to roll out a budget and a budget process for school districts and then come back in the same year and change it. It literally in the year that it affects. That has happened at least once in my career. And of course, you don't know what that is or how significant. I mean, we learn about the economic impacts of this by the month. But it's not uncommon. Oh, I should say, that's not the right phrasing. It is not without precedent for the state to kind of come in the middle of a school year, make a very significant change to revenue, and that for school districts to be in the position of either revising their budget midstream, deciding to draw on fund balance, or a little of both, or etc. So we have, I think, been thinking about this in very conservative terms, given our strong financial situation right now, very conservative terms, so that we would be prepared in the event that that would happen. But there are so many different likelihoods. There's so many different possibilities, shall we say, that it's, you're not planning for a specific contingency. There literally could be, 20 different, 30 different scenarios. And so,
Yeah.
And Mr. Rarick, I might add that I have been talking to one of my representatives who has been around for a long time and been very instrumental in the budget, and somebody I personally trust quite a bit with his experience and all. And he is cautioning that he does not feel the projections that they're making are going to be enough. He feels they're going to be a lot more. They are projecting, and again, that just is interesting. I don't know. I'm wondering if you might speak to the issue of how much do you think, and I'm asking you probably to get in the head of a legislator, which you're not. How much do you think that trying to stabilize certain areas like education as much as possible will play into how they change the budget? I mean, do you think because of some of the history that has gone on, they want to keep our school budgets a little bit more stabilized than ever before, or do you think that's not going to play into it?
No, I think it absolutely will play into it. And so, again, I'll give you my best guess of how this is going to play out. I've thought about it a fair amount. There's one thing that we have going for us as K-12 school districts, and that is that increasingly over time, a greater proportion of the money that the state provides to school districts is, in theory, constitutionally protected and is part of the program of basic education. And the court has ruled on multiple occasions that the legislature cannot merely cannot cut that program of basic education in absent a specific educational reason or basis. What I'm worried about is that the magnitude of the financial impact will be so great on the state that they will be left with a series of very bad choices. Legislators are not want to raise taxes during such an environment, right? If there's only so many dollars, then what's the other alternative? It's fewer programs. The K-12 budget is, I think it was when I was there, and I think it probably still is, over half of the general fund. And the largest remaining portions have to do with health and human services, which are also heavily legally protected. So programs like higher education, corrections, these sorts of programs have the least amount of protection, but also have the least amount of dollars. So I suspect what will happen is that the legislature will try to get pretty creative in how it defines the program of basic education in these circumstances. And we may be in for a bit of a protracted legal argument and perhaps even litigation in terms of arguing about whether the program has been violated and what discretion the legislature enjoys in this environment or doesn't enjoy in this environment. But I'll tell you one thing, I'm clear and positive that we will take cuts. There's just no question about it. It's just a question of how big and when.
So can we do what happened last year? I think last year was not as drastic as this year, but we did have a situation where we were able to sort of compartmentalize and do a matrix of what are the possibilities that could happen this year and how would we adjust, based on those sort of situational scenarios. I realize we have several things that may change this year, but it seems to me that we have some degree of knowledge that it could potentially happen. And so if we can do some sort of an analysis on that and come back to the board, I think that would be really helpful, because I think last year that was very helpful to me to look at how the impacts in one area, I think it was SEB, those kinds of things. How does that impact our budget moving forward? And also we have items that we need to approve that are renewals of contracts and things like that. And I think it's really difficult for us to consider some of that, not knowing where we will be. So sort of a prioritization of what we must approve in the coming school year and what our wishes and wants. I think that would be helpful as well.
And a lot of those contracts, I think, are coming up on our next actual board meeting to renew. So,
yeah,
so they are.
If I can say a word about that. Dr. Harmon, did I cut you off? Were you going to speak?
No, go ahead.
Okay. You will be receiving a number of those at the next board meeting. And I don't want to preempt that conversation, but a number of those involve accounts that are so-called use it or lose it, where we are given a certain allocation within a year, and whatever we don't spend within that year, we return to the state. That'll be a different conversation than types of money where whatever we don't spend accrues in fund balance. So I'm spending a lot of my time right now trying to figure out, for example, in some of these programs where we're just going to send the money back if we don't use it strategically, what is a way that we can use it strategically? And so you may see some of those things on the next agenda, and I want you to have that frame of mind ahead of time to know we can separate the two. Sorry, Dr. Harmon, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that, yes, that's so our being able to differentiate for our renewals, what is essential to the operations of the district. And like Director Vengadaslam said, wishes or wants, or as I describe them, all lowercase letter priorities rather than all capital letter or capital P priorities. And so that's why we wanted to spend time during this particular budget work session to talk about kind of some of these conceptual ideas, some of this foundational understanding, so that the next session when we brought back numbers, you had a perspective of where we were coming from with trying to consider expansion, and why, if we've passed a levy, we're not expanding immediately on all of those things. So we have a beginnings of a plan of how we can have some growth, add and expand in honor of our levy and our promises to our taxpayers, and in light of the priorities that you as board members identified. But knowing that we can't step into all of that right now immediately as we start our school year, because we don't know what's going to happen next.
So when you talk about what we as board members identified, is that from that February 8th meeting?
Yes, so you talked about big areas, not necessarily specific things. Yes, that's what I'm talking about. So we use that kind of as our guide to say, these are areas that our board have identified as things that are important to them, as either they've heard from the community or themselves. And then we've used obviously what our voters approved as considered priorities and important pieces for Kent School District to think about what we should include and expand for the 2021 school year.
And are you taking into account what came out of the thought exchange that the citizens did regarding budget?
So yes. And recognizing that there's some other things that also play into this. So we're also aware that we have labor negotiations coming up as well that will be a part of this that play into budget as well.
So would it be compartmentalized by also the COVID situation versus also an online scenario moving into next school year? Because I think that would be really important to make that distinction.
So
that's a prediction, I know, but
I actually say I cannot say that we have done a estimated budget of what it would look like for a non-traditional opening. Quite honestly, you're almost compounding the areas of unknown, because on top of the possible revenue restrictions and reductions from the state, that would also take labor negotiations as well and impact there. And that's another unknown, as well as the cost of all of the possibly building and other protective equipment, cleaning supply changes, and all of those things. I can't promise that we'll have all that done by the next time we meet to talk about budget, but we can talk about how we might identify buckets of cost for that or something that maybe.
Yes, exactly, and buckets of savings, because you have, you know, energy costs, things like that. That's going to make a big difference as well.
Are there other questions? So the space that's left in our meeting was really to just have this conversation and other questions about kind of context and where we might be headed before we put numbers in front of our board. And so this is helpful.
So when you're looking at the big buckets that the board talked about in February, can you just for the purposes of continuity, explain those out just so it's in this meeting too? So if someone's watching but didn't see on February 8th, they would have some context.
Hold on just a second. I can pull them up for you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Harmon.
Oh, I can't show them, but I can say them.
Yes.
Yeah. Sure. So when we did the activity, you all listed quite a few. And what I asked you to keep just one. And so what made the list as the top of the priority list were mental health, equity, STEM, and school safety. The others, I would say, are general things that we would consider as important in Kent School District, but those were the four that you all identified as the one that you could keep if you could only keep one.
Did we say STEM or STEAM?
It's listed as STEM, but adding an A does not hurt. STEAM is what was listed for the levy. So when we've talked about it as an executive cabinet and priorities, we didn't leave out levy. So keep in mind, we listened to what our board listed as priorities. We also listened to what we promised our voters and what they approved, as well as other inputs. So we didn't lose the A.
Okay, good. Okay.
I would say it's important for us to keep the A, and that
we didn't lose the A.
Yeah, music and the arts is important, and I know that did come up on the thought exchange as well. Yeah, it's going to be interesting because again, it's like all of this is going to be interesting. when Mr. Rarick was talking about students and their mobility, it's like, I think what COVID has done is exactly right. It's turned parents and students into consumers of education as the longer this continues,
One thing that I know is kind of off the wall here and maybe not even totally factored in with our thought process right now, but if we go into a different model, and we have we factored in anything different about childcare for our employees and for our students that might have to be taking care of children, older children or younger children? We don't have anything budgeted or haven't even discussed anything about that, but
So the difficulty of that, President Hamada, is actually twofold. There's the cost of providing that service, and then there's also the literally the added staff that the district then takes on.
mm-hmm.
So then we have to hire more staff to do the childcare portions of that, and then negotiate what that would look like. So again, our future is a little bit unknown. And so I'll say for me, COVID pandemic has taught me that nothing is impossible. Just a different challenge to figure out. But we haven't really talked about building childcare into our budget for the fall as part of a model. In terms of, especially in any way that's similar to right now with what we're doing while we're closed.
And the same meeting that I was on this morning, which was very enlightening in many areas with statistics from a lot of people from King County, was they said that 80% of all the unemployment applications were coming from South King County.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty alarming, meaning that, boy, I wish they would realize that this is the area, not just with school districts. I know they have improved on funding, but all you have to look at that again is when you see 80% of the state's unemployment applications are coming from South King County.
Yep.
That
There's
makes
a lot of Boeing
sense. Yes, a lot of service industry.
Mm-hmm. And on top of that, they were talking about, there is a moratorium on rent and mortgages and stuff like that until I think July 25th. I think the feds have increased that to August 1. And there are some restrictions on if your mortgages or your landlords are funded through federal programs. I don't know, they went through some of them, but that's all the ins and outs of it, that they still might have 30 days beyond August 1st to start to evict people. But everybody in the area was projecting a tsunami about September 1 of evictions and the homelessness numbers increase. So those are all, to me, I know that it's really not directly involved with our budgeting and things, but it's overall picture of the tsunami has not even hit to see where all of this is going to go with our kids and everything.
And President Hamada, it is related because when people participate in their mortgage deferment or forbearance, that is legal and appropriate if you're having financial troubles. For most people, part of their mortgage payment goes into escrow to pay what? Their property tax, which impacts our levy collection. Yep, and so that's a small way that happens, but it does, it's all related. So it's not a concern.
Mm-hmm.
And so Ben, there was a deadline for property tax payment of June 1, yes?
I thought it was June 15th, but I can get that. It was June.
It's June. So are we anticipating that that's going to help our revenue for the current period, or is the state anticipating that that's going to, due to what President Hamada said, that we might be not seeing, might be seeing people not paying their property taxes?
Yeah, honestly, Dr. Bentner, I would just be guessing. I mean, I'm expecting tax collections to remain low just because I don't know how they couldn't, given.
Right.
I'm just expecting that there's people out there that, I mean, just the reaction we've seen on handing out school lunches and the distress, you know, like this is impacting people in a very real way.
Yes.
I can't imagine that property taxes is not going to be impacted.
Mm-hmm.
So this might sound like a ridiculous question. What about our LEA? Is that at all applicable in what could happen if we were to collect less taxes? Or is it only dependent on the cost of your home?
Yeah, good question. Let me I have to think about that for just a second.
Yeah, I mean, does it bring the dollar per student down? I mean, I think it's based on that, the LEA. So
yeah, so here's the headliner on LEA before we get into any complicated formulas. The largest chunk of money that the state sends school districts that's not protected by the Constitution is LEA. So I expect to see major cuts in levy equalization funding. Just because it's now it's a politically extremely difficult thing to pull off, and the legislature has on times run bills to try to cut it and fail to pass the bill because they couldn't get a vote on it. But it's outside the program of basic education, so it's usually the first thing. Now, luckily, we are not a high LEA district, so I think this year, you know, I mean, we're talking about, oh shoot, don't quote me, but maybe a couple $1 million for this year. And then next year we were projecting that to go down by half, I think. So I apologize if I have to, that more or less is roughly accurate. So the point being that I wouldn't want to be, you know, there's some districts that pull down a lot of LEA as a percentage of their budget. We are not them right now. And those districts, you know, I expect to be very active on the Hill next year, you know, on that issue. But, you know, that's been the kind of the thing that snuck up on us here, is that even though we have large pockets of our community where, you know, families are in economic need, our overall property wealth is really taken off. And so it has mitigated our ability to impact LEA in the way we might think we should, because of the poverty levels that we do have in pockets of our community. So I am not planning for a large chunk of LEA for next year's budget. And if we lose that amount, it will be certainly meaningful, as every bit we get from the state is meaningful, but it won't be game changing, shall we say.
Yeah, I know the board directors are around our area are particularly going after that legislative wise. And so I know they'll want us to kind of piggyback on it. So I wanted to get a sense of where we stood.
And I believe Representative Pat Sullivan is in our region, and I know from having worked from him for like 6 years, he is in particular passionate about local levy equalization. I used to block bills that tried to cut it on equity principle alone. So we're well represented on that issue.
Okay, thank you.
He is up for election.
I'm not making a political statement.
I'm making an advocacy statement, I think.
I wonder talking about different funding and where it's coming from, if, and I know this is like totally hypothetical because we don't know what's going to happen yet, is if businesses aren't opening or going under, or if they're only opening back up at half capacity, or, depending on what stage we're in, that's going to impact the families, and then that's going to impact whether or not people are applying for free and reduced lunch. And doesn't that also affects the schools then too? So that will be bad for households, but I mean, how will that affect the schools?
Yeah.
So it won't have that will have a truly kind of flat or negative impact.
Okay.
Next school year. I mean, meaning that there's not going to be an impact the next school year. But for the 21-22 school year,
okay,
those free and reduced lunch percentages on record high could mean good things for Title I, for LAP, for other federal grant program things that are based on free and reduced lunch percentages. But there's, unless, which is very unlikely, the state or the federal government gives some influx of cash to school districts to accommodate for that for next school year, which is unlikely. It's not going to be a big benefit that way. And for families that qualify for free and reduced lunch, that's always covered in the midst of, as it changes throughout a school year. So those families would be covered, those students would be covered during the school year regardless.
I'm just wondering if there's going to be maybe an influx of families applying for that.
I would guess, because right now, I mean, if we're going by meal service for the summer, I would say that there's going to be an influx of that. And so we've already talked about kind of our getting the word out for the application process, so families are aware what they need to do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, and this is another question that's a long shot that's somewhat maybe related to budget is, and kind of piggybacking off what Director Bowen said is, as we open in these phases, sometimes I think the responsibility of some of these getting jobs and things like that can fall to our high school kids as well and impact their enrollment and education and the need to utilize some of our programs like iGrad and KPA and KMBA. Have we thought about that too, as it concerns budget? And, again, even I can't remember who said about daycare and stuff, if a student is needing to watch a younger sibling while a parent works and needs to then move to like the iGrad model for the hours and things, have we considered things like that in our budget?
I can speak to the part of that. So, yeah, a little bit. I don't know if I can share what I have thought about on the enrollment side. In addition to the online dynamic that we talked about, one of the things that we're also talking about is, depending on how things shake out regulatorily at the community college level, if we haven't had intense interest in Running Start already, we could have even more interest in that. If for somehow the community college kind of arrangement of how you access your classes and the frequency with which you are on campus and all that offers an alternative to students that's more attractive. Again, I'm making a lot of assumptions about what we will actually do, which we're deciding on, but I could see migration from the basic ed community to the Running Start community. And then you mentioned iGrad. I don't think that we adjusted our enrollment projections for iGrad. it's a smaller component of our total population, obviously. But it's hard to say. There's factors going in each direction on that one.
And the rules for iGrad enrollment are a little bit slipperier than that. So technically under state law, they can't be a direct transfer from a traditional high school model into iGrad. So KPA, KMVA, yes, more so. It's a little bit more nuanced how we get them into iGrad that way. But I could see the increased need for non-traditional models, and Ben has talked about that. And we've even talked about what might our strategies be as a district as a whole to be more competitive as parents are exercising more choice.
Thank you, Dr. Harmon and Mr. Rarick. Thank you for, first of all, the presentation and time to our team from Human Resources for really providing a high-level perspective of the complexities of our budgeting process. And so, given our time, while it is 7:11, if there are any further questions that you do have, feel free. And obviously, those questions don't need to stop once we've dismissed from this meeting. But know that we will have another presentation scheduled. Karen will be sharing some information via email to confirm specific times, but we know that we do have another opportunity for us to delve a little deeper, and as we prepare for our 2021 academic year.
Dr. Watts, just as I know we brought this up, but I think it would be important to get some information on the special education funding increase.
Yes.
And programmatically how that's going to work, as well as budgetarily. And I think we have some, I think some funds already committed, I'm not sure, but what would we expect to come in the coming school year? Because I know there was an increase this legislative session, but we're expecting additional increase, and I don't know what that is. So given our innovative program discussions and all of that, that would be important for us to know.
We'll certainly add that to the conversation.
Yeah, that and the EL programs too, how
Yes.
that would work, in this new setup. I think those are our two big buckets of expenses, so.
And how we're
More
addressing the
details, the
needs of our most vulnerable at times, most vulnerable student groups. That's clearly that's a priority for us. It always has been, always should be. But in these times, it will be a greater focus for us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, and this is just kind of a comment, but it appears that some real advocacy and some real being an Olympia, a lot more emphasis and developing any type of relationship we can with our local representatives and senators could be even more important than ever before to try to get our needs met. So I'll put on my advocacy hat here.
We appreciate that. We've begun the conversations and we'll continue, obviously, but I appreciate your support and our board from a legislative standpoint. Our voice matters. We are the 5th largest and the 4th most diverse school district in the state of Washington. So our voice does carry some weight. Given that, I want to thank everyone for your engagement, for your questions. While we may not have all of the answers, we had many of them this evening, and the others that we were not, we'll make sure that we prepare those for our next presentation. But until then, again, I want to thank our team for sharing and thank our board for being engaged and asking all the right questions. But we'll certainly circle back with you and with details for next meeting. Okay.
And I just I just
turn
wanted
it back over to you, President Hamada. Yes.
I just wanted to add that I thought tonight was very educational and informative in many areas. I know how hard things are for all of you right now. All the things that keep changing every day. I can't even go to the grocery store now when I need my groceries to pick them up because, you know, it's constantly changing in our life. It's a lot. It's a lot.
Yes.
So, but excellence in what you're doing, in your professionalism, is extremely important to me and to our board. So thank you very much for all your hard work.
Thank you. We appreciate that. Thank you. All right.
Thank you, Dr. Watts. Thank you, Ben, Dr. Harmon, all,
Absolutely.
and Ms. Frazier. Thank you.
No,
Yeah, Jamie, Tim, Dr. Harmon, Dr. Watts,
thank
Ben,
you.
Israel, he piped up too.
Israel.
But thank you, everyone. Yeah,
Yes,
you,
well,
you
we
bet.
we
Thank you.
appreciate it. And the work still continues.
yeah.
But everyone continue to stay safe and be well, and we will be back in touch very soon. Okay.
Okay, thank you
All
very
right.
much.
Thank you.
Good night.
Everybody have a good night.
Have a
Bye.
good night.
Good
Bye-bye.
Dr. Watts, have you left?
You did. Thanks for your patience with my daughter coming in.
She's adorable. She's adorable.
Yeah,
And
she's been here like 20 times.
But the kids are, I mean, from my perspective, have been pretty